Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first of our What Economists Really Do events. Now, just by way of a brief introduction, the idea for this series came when Alex, our first speaker today, and my name's Abby Adams-Prassel. It came about when we were talking about our research and the research of other economists that we admire. And like the fact that when we were discussing with people outside the department, we were often met with the reaction, wait, like what? This is really economics? And so what we kind of want to share with you is that, there's much more to economics than just the stock market. And you can, often find economists working with policymakers, with people in businesses, other actors on a diverse range of topics. And through this series, we're really hoping to showcase some examples of this. And so without further ado, it's an absolute pleasure to introduce Alex Teytelboym, who's an associate professor in the economics department at Oxford and a fellow at St. Catherine's College, and also a senior research fellow at the Institute for New Economic Thinking. Now, a lot of Alex's research interests centre on so-called market design and auction theory, and he often can be found applying theoretical insights from these topics on a range of practical problems, including refugee resettlement and environmental protection, which is the topic of today's talk. So just in terms of a little bit of bookkeeping, so Alex is going to have the floor now for about 30 minutes. I have a couple of burning questions, which I will use to kind of get the discussion started after that. And then we'll be opening up to you for questions, which you can post through the Q&A function. So with that, thanks again, Alex, for starting off the series. Over to you for the next 30 minutes.
Thank you so much, Abby. Delighted to be here and to kick off What Economists Really Do. Of course, I'm not going to pretend I know what all economists really do. I'll just tell you about what I do as an economist. And as Abby said, I'll talk about markets for biodiversity, really, and the broad issue of economics of biodiversity. So let me just kind of give you a very brief explanation of what biodiversity is. It's the diversity of life, and economists have been thinking about it for a very long time. And I think many people had heard about the great economics of climate change review by Lord Nicholas Stern, which came out in 2006, and really was a kind of foundation for economists to think about climate change. And perhaps fewer of you know that in 2021, just this year, there's been a review of the economics of biodiversity. And it was led by magnificent economists, Sir Partha Dasgupta from University of Cambridge. So economists have been thinking about this topic to the point where now policymakers have really started paying attention. And indeed, both of these reports were commissioned by the Treasury, because it is now a biodiversity and climate change are issues that not just environmentalists think about, but indeed finance ministers do as well. So let me give you sort of three broad trends in biodiversity, which are extremely worrying. And I will talk about throughout this short talk today. So the first thing one notices is that biodiversity is impacted by the loss of forests. Forests are places where there's a lot of biodiversity. And in some places around the world, forest cover has been increasing. In fact, if you look at on the scale of something like the last 100 years, in most of Western Europe, forest cover has been increasing. And that's also been true more recently. But if you look in places like Central Africa or South America, where the primary forests are, the most biodiversity-rich forests, they've been declining very rapidly in the last 30 years. And it's in part due to natural causes like fires, but a lot of it is due to deforestation, which is, of course, a huge concern. The second thing that I want to mention is fisheries. So the ocean is a huge source of biodiversity. Often we think about coral reefs as being sort of habitat for a lot of fish and other species. But in particular, of course, ocean is also a source of consumption for us as humans, and we use marine life for sustenance. But unfortunately, a lot of fisheries have become unsustainable over the last decades, which is a great shame. There's been a lot of effort to actually try to make fisheries sustainable, and yet the trend is still that many fisheries are becoming more and more sustainable. And when a fishery is depleted, the fish is gone, and it's very hard. It takes a very long time for them to recover. And the last thing to say, to mention, is the extraordinary decline in species around the world. These are often, people often think about large species, rhinos, for example, elephants. But if you look at just, overall bird count, for example, in the US, and you look at the last 40 years, there's been a massive decline. So the headline number here is 3 billion birds have disappeared from the United States. And what is particularly sad is that where you see the greatest declines are in places where the habitats are disappearing. So if you look at the grasslands and forests, for example, where a lot of the birds, as the forests disappear, the birds disappear as well. Where the habitats have done well, like in the wetlands in the US, in particular, where they've been protected by, in fact, a market mechanism, the birds are still there, and they're doing well. So the question, I guess, is, we've having seen these three terrible trends, you can think about them as sort of market failures, right? I mean, you don't think about a market necessarily, for birds. You probably haven't until today, because I'm going to tell you this is exactly what I'm going to talk about. But you can think about, I think it's much easier to think about a fishery being depleted as a type of market failure, right? As a kind of a commons problem where the market performs very poorly, right? The outcome of the market is very inefficient. So what do market designers do? People call themselves market designers. I consider myself as part of this crowd. I'll give you my definition. People have many definitions of this. So here's my definition that I've come up with two of my co-authors. So it translates economic theory and analysis into practical solutions to real world problems. And today I'll give you 3 of these real world problems. And by redesigning the rules that guide the transactions and creating infrastructure that enables those transactions to take place, market designers can address a broad range of market failures. And of course, these market failures go way beyond the environmental ones that I'm going to mention today. And in fact, 4 people have already got a Nobel Prize for this topic. So 2 of them is Al Roth and Lloyd Shapley. They thought about matching markets, so markets in which not just the price matters, but also really who you match with. And they thought about markets with these features. And more recently, Paul Milgram and Bob Wilson got the prize for auction design and auction theory. And I will be talking more about auctions today. So I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. In fact, I even work with giants. So this is a huge community, a collaborative community. It's a community that doesn't just work within academia, but it works across policy and industry and business and so on. So it's a wonderful community to be in. And I encourage everybody to join it. So let me tell you very briefly about environmental marketplaces that people have created. Some of you might seem familiar. So the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme is a very famous environmental marketplace. It is how the European Union is trying to reduce its industrial emissions over time. And what happens in this system is that different firms that are polluting get permits for pollution, and then they trade them. And the hope is that by trading them, we can figure out exactly what the costs of abating pollution are, and actually reduce pollution at the lowest possible cost. And of course, this is specifically related to climate change and carbon emissions. This is what the aim of the European emission trading system is, but there have been other systems for trading sulfur dioxide permits and all sorts of things like that. There are systems that exist for trading waste that goes into water streams, so to improve water quality. And as I've already mentioned, there are even systems, market-based systems, in order to restore wetlands in the United States. Something like a $3 billion a year market for restoration of wetlands. And as you had seen before, it has a dramatic impact not just on the presence of wetlands, which have more or less stabilized over the last 30 years in the United States. So the loss has been dramatically minimized, but also has impact on the species that actually live in these wetlands. And as you saw, the bird decline has not been as steep. Now, I'm going to talk about three different things today. One of them is going to be about forests, which I worry about, and they're disappearing. The other thing I'm going to talk about is fisheries. And the third thing is going to be a bird habitat. So, forests. Now, this project is, as I said, market designers collaborate all the time. None of my projects are an exception. And this project is with two magnificent market designers, Jonathan Colmer, who's an environmental economist, and Scott Homenes, who really does work on the theory of market design. So when you think about protecting a forest or or forest disappearing, the first thing that might come to mind is, well, you should reforest. You should just create forests anew. And that's always an option. And some countries have pursued this. So Costa Rica, for example, has gone from a forest cover of something like 20% around the time when I was born to now half of the country being again covered in forest. And they've achieved this by giving landowners payments for reforestation. And that system has worked very well. It has been part of their development strategy as a country, but it's also allowed them to reforest. And that's worked well. Now, of course, there are some forests that are so rich and so rare that cutting them down and replacing them with new forests is not going to quite restore the same biodiversity that was there in the first place. But it can at least have a very good impact on things like carbon sequestration, soil quality, water retention, and so on. So forests are wonderful things, even if you cannot quite get the original forest. If you haven't managed to protect it, it's often still better to reforest. So the other option you have is to make sure that the forest that is already there is not cut down, because in many countries around the world, the timber industry and forests are a source of income, and people have strong incentives to want to cut them down. So how would you go about doing this? Well, you can imagine that if we were to think about what happens over time to forest cover, there might be a landowner who's thinking about cutting some trees. So we could figure out what his business as usual scenario is. He might, be depleting the stock of trees over time. Maybe he'll be doing it slowly. Maybe he's a very sustainable forester, and actually the business as usual is very flat because obviously the trees grow back over time. But the business as usual might be quite unacceptable. And so what you might wish to do is to compensate the landowner by making them change their trajectory with payments. And so this reduction against the baseline is exactly what we want to achieve with these payments. So this is quite tricky because the thing to figure out is exactly what the baseline is. And what's been great in recent years is using data, huge amounts of data that comes from satellites, to be able to not only monitor what people are doing over time, but being able to kind of aggregate data on what the different prices of timber is and exactly how landowners are behaving over time, to be able to predict this business as usual much, much more accurately than we could in the past, where typically people would engage with one project at a time. Here you can get data on thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of landowners, and make these predictions actually reasonably good. Now, it's still it's a science. There's obviously going to be errors in doing this, but you would hope that this would only improve over time. So what is one way of setting the system up? So you've got all these landowners, you sort of know what their business as usual is. How might you then achieve the maximum forest conservation you could within some particular budget? And so what we had done is we decided to do this with an auction. So how does one go about doing this? Well, this might look very familiar, price and quantity, and we have a supply curve. And so what landowners do is they bid in a quantity of forest conservation they want to do beyond their business as usual at different prices. So the landowner might say, I will conserve an extra 30 hectares of land at let's say $15 an acre or something like that. Now, on the other side, who are the buyers? And there's many corporations. This is what's called a voluntary carbon market. There's a lot of corporations that are willing to pay for high quality carbon permits often specifically related to forestry. So that gives us a demand curve. And this, as you will see in a moment, this auction is very competitive. And so a sensible design for this auction is to run it as a uniform price auction. That is, there's one price that's going to clear this market and is going to give us a market clearing quantity. So this might seem kind of nice theory. And the question is, does it work in practice? And the answer is sort of. Well, we tried it. And so we partnered with this startup called NCX, Natural Capital Exchange. And we ran an auction like this in the summer. And we had more than 1,000 landowners participating, and 2/3 of their bids were accepted. There was a supply curve, and there were corporations that they reached out to that wanted to buy these permits, including the ones famous companies like Microsoft and Cargill. And I can tell you what the results were. The clearing price was about $12 a ton. This is kind of already converted into tons of carbon. And we managed to sequester something like the equivalent of 500,000 metric tons of carbon. It's not a huge amount, right, in the grand scheme of things, but it's better than nothing. And so this is a small step. And what's great about using this kind of technology is that you can scale these auctions massively. So from the first auction to the second auction, we increase the size of an auction by about a 5-fold. And hopefully in the next iteration, we can increase it by about a 5-fold again. And so what's great about, I think, this kind of approach is that allows you to have impact at a large scale reasonably quickly. So that's forests. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is fisheries. And here I have two magnificent collaborators, Sana Laksa and Daniel Maslak, who we've been working with in the fisheries. Now, fisheries is kind of a very mixed story. Fishery management is very mixed around the world, and one of the great management systems is called an individual transferable quota. So it's a special fisheries term for a fishing permit that you can trade. It's called ITQ. So it's exactly the same as a permit that you might get for emitting pollution, right? So the system works in a very similar way, and you can often transfer them between different countries. You can trade them. In some countries, like the one I'll tell you about, you get the quota, but you can't trade it. So they might not necessarily be transferable. But what seems to be the case, and this is a quote from probably the most eminent fisheries economist in the world, is that it seems that these individual transferable quotas are the only fisheries management system currently employed around the world that can claim a degree of general success, that is, in maintaining stocks to be sustainable. And so the government that we've worked with had these quotas for a while, but they had the following question: who should get the quotas in the first place? You know, it really matters whether you're going to start out your fisheries year with a lot of quota or a little quota, and especially if you can trade them. If you have too few quota, you might not be able to get your boats out. And so what they decided to do be to auction these quotas to the fishing companies, and this happened in the Faroe Islands. And the standard question whenever you tell people about Faroe Islands is, where are the Faroe Islands? And so here we are. Just so you know, you can, if you look at the map very closely, you should be able to spot them. It's written in the really big capital letters. They're right here. Okay, it's a tiny little spot of land between the Shetlands and Iceland. Now, the government of the Faroe Islands is really reliant on fishery revenues for their income, and so they really needed to make sure that they get this right. And before we got involved in this project, they started running this auction, and the bidding in this auction looked a little bit like what I'm about to show you. Now, what's great about this auction is that the auction design was exactly the same design as I just shown you for the case of the forests. It was what's called a uniform price auction. So each bidder was bidding for how much quota they want. So this was this is what it looks like. This is the picture straight from a paper, right, that we wrote about this. And the supply curve, in this case, now remember, now here we have bidders bidding for demand, and this is the black line. And there's a supply curve, which is how much quota the government wanted to sell. And it's about sort of 330 tons. You see the gray line here on the picture. Now, what we noticed is that the bidders were bidding in a slightly strange way. They seem to be bidding a pretty flat price for a lot of the quota. And then suddenly their demand, and this is for the three bidders that were the real incumbents, suddenly their demand would drop off just before the quantity that the government planned to supply. Now, there was no uncertainty in this quantity. The quantity was given to them. I think this is quite strange. You know, we went and talked to people in the industry to try and understand kind of how boats work. And there was nothing that seems to indicate that this, you know, they were very constrained in capacity or anything like that. This seemed kind of strange behavior. And so we call these crank handle bids. And these things have been noticed in the past. People have noticed this in other contexts. But this was a very striking example of this. And so it occurred reasonably quickly to us exactly what these bidders were doing. So what exactly are they doing? Well, they really like the fact that at the moment they have a very low market clearing price, right? Because the supply intersects demand at a very low price. So why is this quite clever? Well, what these bidders are really doing, they're colluding. They have figured out that by colluding, they will be able to get this low market price. Now I think, okay, well, how do you achieve this collusion? Well, you've got to make sure that nobody's too tempted to deviate. Of course, they submit these bids in an envelope, which gets opened by a government official. They don't know who is bidding what. And so they need to be quite careful to make sure that nobody wants to sneakily go and get a bit more quota than they're supposed to. So what happens if you decide to grab a little bit more quota in this kind of world? Well, you will extend your demand. You will try to get more. And so the demand curve might shift out a little bit in the following way. And what this does, and this is very particular to this kind of auction format, is that it dramatically increases the market clearing price, which is previously you were paying, let's say, something like 2 krona for a permit. Now you're paying 7 times more for each permit that you buy, right? So this is a terrible idea to do. If you've agreed, if you've already agreed with the other bidders that this is what you want to do, then you should absolutely not try to deviate and get a little bit more quota, because you will not just harm them by making the price jump up, but you also harm yourself and you end up vastly overpaying. So this high point of this demand curve is way above what anybody would pay for this quota. So it's certainly a self-enforcing strategy, which has worked very well. And these bidders, amazingly enough, figured this out very quickly. And they used this for a couple of years. And eventually, when we got involved and we saw these patterns of bidding, we suggested a redesign of the auction to try to eliminate this. And indeed, the redesign worked very well. And rather than using this uniform price auction, we suggested what's called discriminatory price auction, where you pay the quantity. You pay the price that you bid, essentially. Here, you don't price the price that you pay the price that clears the market. And instead, we suggested that the bidders should simply pay what they bid. And that eliminated this type of strategic behavior, which has been very harmful to the government, because they were, of course, raising very little revenue from this auction, which was very upsetting to them. And so sometimes you don't get to design a market completely from scratch. You have to redesign an existing market to make it function better. And that's another job that many market designers end up doing. So let me finally tell you a little bit about habitats, and this work is with my 2 magnificent colleagues, Elizabeth Baldwin, who's designed auctions for the UK energy system, and Paul Klemperer, who's designed the largest spectrum auction in the UK, as well as the famous Bank of England liquidity auction. So working with 2 colleagues who are extremely experienced, and we got, I think, the most romantic project to work on, I think, in the history of market design, I would claim. And it happens to be about these magnificent species, turtle doves. So let me tell you quickly about turtle doves. It's a species that is very dear to many people, especially we're coming up to Christmas. People think about turtle doves much more. But it's also a species that is in decline in the UK, and it's in part because intensive agriculture has meant that a lot of the habitats have been destroyed. And so when they come over, migrate from North Africa, and they make it to Britain to breed here, often they fail to do so, and so the population has been falling. And so what DEFRA, the UK ministry that's charged with supporting agriculture and the environment, has done is that they asked us to partner with the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds to try and figure out ways of allocating funding to try and save this magnificent species. So as we learned from the RSPB, Elizabeth, Paul and I, that turtle doves need three things. They're quite simple things, actually. They need some scrub. It's just got a place where you can go and nest and do things that makes more turtle doves. They need some water, clearly for drinking, and they need some food, which in our case is going to be kind of the main part of this. It's going to be a seed mix that you can scatter on a field. And what is peculiar about these things is that not only do turtle doves need all of these three things, they also like them to be located in a very particular way. So they prefer them to be close, but they also want these clusters to be spread out. And so this is ecologically is what maximizes the kind of the total amount turtle dove breeding. So we want to make sure that the water scrub and the mix are nearby to get these kind of clusters, these little ecosystems where the turtle doves can succeed. But these little clusters should be spread out. And so you really worry about how the whole landscape is covered in these ecosystems. And so this makes it quite difficult to figure out exactly who should be providing these parts of the ecosystem. So we thought it would make sense to create an auction to do this. And in particular, what we wanted to do is to incentivize farmers to use their fields or margins of their fields to supply this seed mix. So the scrub, the hedgerows are already going to be there, so we needed to know where exactly they were. Water is often there because there might be rivers or streams, but in fact, the farmers could also dig their own ponds, and so there was an incentive to do that as well. But the key issue was kind of making sure things are located in the right place. So what really mattered is not just the price, but also the location. I'll show you that in a moment. And we got some marvelous coverage, especially The Economist was particularly wonderful in the headline. I think they call it dovish policy, which I think was a great headline that we will treasure for a long time. So economists seek to save a romantic species. It's really rather wonderful. So let me tell you about how this works. Now, what's cool about this auction is that it's what's called a combinatorial auction. So it's not an auction we've invented. It's an auction that's been used in many places before, but we think it's the first time this type of format has been used to enhance habitats. And so here is kind of what it looks like. You can imagine there's a river and maybe a few ponds. And so what and scrub, and what the farmers would do is that they would draw an area on the map where they would be planning to put the food mix in. The seeds that the turtle doves could have at the particular point in the year when the turtle doves are around, and they would attach a price to it. Now, what you don't want to do is to simply pick the cheapest plots, because they might not be the best ones. Even per acre cheapest are not necessarily the best ones. What we want to do is to pick the best combination of bids that in conjunction with the water and the scrub are going to maximize our objective, which is what? Which is turtle dove happiness. We want to make them happy and make them breed. And we came up with this unit of measure called the TADA, which stands for turtle dove happiness. So our objective is to maximize TADAs, and there's a very complex kind of ecological module that basically aggregates bids and scores them in all the combinations in the right way, and then spits out what is the best combination of bids given the budget that we had. And they might not be the most obvious bids at all. They might actually look quite expensive, but in fact they have a lot of ecological value. And so I think there's a lot of potential for these kinds of things. What's amazing about, I think, doing something like combinatorial auctions in this context, you can optimize all these ecosystem features on a landscape level, which is really unusual. Often the way that environmental policy proceeds is sort of piecemeal. You go to each farmer and ask them to do a thing, and then they do it, but it's not dependent on what the other farmers are doing. And so this doesn't sort of aggregate in a good way. And so you never really kind of think about the landscape as a whole. It's always different bits of the landscape. But since everything is complementary and interdependent when it comes to biodiversity, you really need to think about the whole system at the time. And this kind of auction allows you to do that. So in particular, you can get the best value for money, where value is typically ecological value. It could be TDAs, but it could be other measures as well. It could be forests. It could be whatever you want. But you can really think about what the objective is clearly, and get the best value for money. And so I think there's got a lot of potential to use around the world, and I really hope that these types of auctions get replicated elsewhere. But I better stop now because Abby allocated me exactly half an hour, and I'm bang on time. I'll just conclude with a slide just to emphasize one thing, that one of the great things about being an economist doing market design, that you get to collaborate with wonderful people from all kind of backgrounds who've done all sorts of things and know so much more often than you can imagine about really different topics. And so I hope more people get involved in market design. Even if you've never done market design as an economist, if you're a budding economist, you should come and join our fabulous community. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Alex. Now, for all those people listening, please start putting any questions that you have in the chat. If you could also put your name if in the chat with along with your question as well, that would be great. But to get us started, so actually, like following on from the work you've been doing with turtle doves, Alex, like of course turtle doves, very important for many reasons, as you said, but like, I guess one of the things I've been wondering is like, what kind of challenges do you reckon would kind of arise if you wanted to scale these ideas, to say allocate agricultural subsidies, or kind of using auctions? Have you kind of considered any of those scaling issues?
Yeah, I mean, and actually that's what the UK government exactly wanted to do. The reason why they were so keen on our project is because it was sort of a test case for a broader scheme. So Britain is transitioning from using being in the common agricultural policy to having what they called environmental land management, their own scheme to be able to support agriculture and hit environmental objectives. And this was one of the projects where they thought, okay, let's try something new. And one of the things we had to think about immediately was, well, how does that scale, right? Can we do more than just turtle doves? And kind of interesting challenges arise. So actually here, running things on a smaller scale in some sense makes them harder. So what happens is, because the bids of the farmers are very interdependent, it actually, and if they really know this, right? If they really knows that the value of my bid is only valuable if you, Abby, bid something, right? You can imagine that there's scope for us to collude perhaps in the auction, right? Yeah. And so one of the things that you need to do is to make sure that there's enough competition so that this doesn't happen. And what you really want to get is kind of groups, if you like, of farmers competing against other groups of farmers, because it's very, on a local scale, you want to make sure that you exploit the complementarity. But if you try to exploit the complementarity too much, you end up, having to overpay people, because they will certainly overbid. But if you have a lot of these clusters competing against one another for funding, I think it's going to work really well. You can really get real value for money. And so in a way, actually trying this on a small scale was hard. We still had clusters competing against one another, specifically to draw, to get as much efficiency as possible. But you could scale this to kind of hundreds of clusters. I think could be much better. Of course, it becomes more difficult, because then you need to think, okay, what exactly is going to be our objective once we have general agricultural subsidies, right? And farmers might be resistant to the system. Nobody really likes participating in an auction, right? We like designing auctions, but everyone's very nervous when they're at an auction. I think farmers who are, concerned about their business, they just want to get on. They don't want to have that anxious moment about whether they won or not, right? But it does seem to really massively drive, efficiency and value, which is of course very important for the government.
Yeah, and I guess like kind of on that value point, auctioning some, or like kind of having these kind of auctions to kind of like create value either through quotas or through like the auctioning off of like various property rights, seems like something governments should be thinking about when they're short of cash, especially like perhaps given COVID. Are there countries kind of exploring, well, I guess as you said as well, like the Das Quota report was commissioned by the Treasury here. Like are various countries considering these types of mechanisms actually for revenue raising in addition to, if you like, kind of environmental protection?
Yeah, I mean, totally. So even if you think about the European Emission Trading Scheme, about half of the permits in there are already auctioned off. and the European Union recycles those revenues into supporting, green tech innovation and stuff like that. So this is already something that goes on. Paul Klemper and I had an opportunity to advise a government in a developing country recently, which had an explicit objective of raising revenue from fishing quotas. So we helped a bit with an auction design. And in fact, the auction design we suggested was exactly the same auction design that we had suggested to the Faroese before that, which, as I mentioned, avoided this collusion. But the government was very explicit. They're not that interested in the efficiency part, because they really had a lot of problems after COVID because they were short on funds, and they used that in the mandate to raise as much revenue as possible. So when we were thinking about this auction and exactly how to design it, that was the objective that we had in mind. And at least the first auction we helped design, it went quite well. But it comes with its own challenges, right? So it's different contexts bring very different challenges, and sometimes it's very difficult to get a lot of revenue, because of course a lot of revenue for the government means a lot of payment from the bidders. There's a lot of resistance to these schemes all the time. So there's always some back and forth.
I guess one scenario where you might not get a lot of resistance is if you're paying people to do things they were kind of going to do already. So I guess so actually in a sense you always, I guess you can tell that things are constraining the market participants if there is arse and grumbles. I guess I'm kind of thinking about this in the context of your forest conservation auctions, and so if that kind of like baselines aren't particularly well measured, how do you how have you thought about that in terms of protecting against just paying people to do what they were going to do anyway?
Empirical economist. Typical. Well, I think I have an answer. So I think what you've spotted, and I think this is crucial, is that if you mismeasure the baseline and actually think, well, Abby is a kind of landowner that is going to cut all of her trees down anyway, then you could come into this auction, submit a really low bid, and still get paid something really good. In fact, you should be really worried about people who are submitting very competitive bids, right? So this is kind of an issue. So one of the things you absolutely should be careful about is how you sort of treat the uncertainty in the baseline. So it's probably a very bad idea to just use a straight up, mean estimate of your baseline. So one of the things you might want to do is to be conservative about what the baseline is. Now, this comes at a cost, right? So I might think Abby's probably going to cut down 100 hectares. I'm not entirely sure. So I'm going to pretend like Abby is actually only going to cut 50. But of course, there is this intermediate case where actually Abby was planning to cut 75. And what's happened is that I've just priced Abby entirely out of the auction. Now you see, so you have to be sort of smart about exactly how much you do this adjustment. Ultimately, the objective there should be, I think, the one you're suggesting, which is additionality. What you want to do is to ensure that you sequester additional tons of carbon with these projects. And I think in the past, especially when you're doing kind of piecemeal project with very little data, it's very hard to measure the baseline. And so a lot of work has been shown to kind of pointed out that actually we were paying people for not doing, things, we were paying them for doing things they would have done anyway. In fact, if I may just plug my co-author's work just for one moment, so Jonathan Colmer has a really interesting paper, not about biodiversity markets, but looking at subsidies for wind farms in India. And what he finds is that something like half of the projects would have taken place anyway. And this is by looking very carefully at what the cost structure is. And so it's very hard, right? It can be very difficult. And often, these subsidies is the best tool we have. We can't do much better than that, right? So is it better than not subsidizing wind farms at all? It's an empirical question, right? So again, sometimes you can't achieve everything with market design or auction design, right? But maybe you can do just a bit better than what we're doing already.
Now, this leads on to a question in the chat, which this may be a bit of a mean one, but from Nicholas, who it kind of follows on from what you were just saying. So Nicholas asks, so if economic growth and market mechanisms have brought us into a situation where natural capital is being rapidly depleted, do we really think that the use of market mechanisms will help in the solution?
Yes, Nicholas, 100 times yes. So the reason why these the natural capital is being depleted is because the price for it is zero. If we had a price for natural capital, for different forms of natural capital, we know it would be used well. So I'll give it the most obvious way to see it is think about how commodity market works. These resources are inherently finite, and yet we seem to be never running out of any commodity, right? So you look at anything that is traded on the mercantile exchange, these are finite resources, and yet we're not running out of them. The resources I'm talking about here are renewable, and yet we're depleting them. And the only reason why it happens is because the price for these things is zero. That's what it means for the market to fail. And so what we're trying to do is to get the market to work, because when the market works right, it's not, capitalism solves it. It's just the incentives of the participants in the market are then correctly aligned. So absolutely, I am 100% all in for, I think it's better to have a market than not. And you could maybe come up with even better systems, but I think it is often better to put a price on these things. And people worry that it might lead to commodification, for example. When people think about wetlands, they say, well, when you restore a wetland, it's not the same thing as destroying a wetland. And so you have to be sensitive to the fact that things are often difficult to compare and aggregate. And I completely accept this. There's no question about that. When you set up these markets, often you do commodify to some extent. But it seems like the alternative is, if the alternative is doing nothing, it is so much worse, because look at what it's leading to, and especially in developing countries, to the kind of loss, right? And so actually creating property rights and creating market makers, I actually think it makes things better.
Indeed, Paddy Carter was asking the example that you mentioned in terms of India from Jonathan's work. Were those subsidies allocated by wind farms? And if not, do you see a kind of a promising fix from
in fact, the point about whether this was a good system or not is what Paddy raised on Twitter when we had this debate. So I don't know how, if this was better or not. This was within a context of what's called the Clean Development Mechanism, which is a UN scheme following on from the Kyoto Protocol, which tried to allocate funding from developed countries to developing countries to help them transition to cleaner energy. And so, they had a way of trying to figure out which projects would not have happened, and the claim of Jonathan's paper is that he didn't do a particularly good job out of it. But as I said, maybe this was still so much better than doing nothing at all, right? So even though I'm being a bit hard on perhaps this particular case, very often this is really the best we can do. Maybe there were better systems that could have been designed, but of course, you could have run into the same problem I was describing with the forestry auction, right? The wrong kind of bidders might have been selecting into the auction. In the end, you still need to screen your participants correctly, right? And this is always going to be a challenge.
And another question, it was about how you kind of collaborate across disciplines in this area. So the question is, many of your collaborators are other economists. How do you learn or gain from the work in ecology and environmental sciences in your market design work?
I mean, to just give you an example of, say, the project with Paul and Elizabeth and the RSPB, most of the time that I think we spent on it was being to try to understand the ecology of turtle doves and translating that into how the auction would actually function. So I think relatively early on, we understood what the appropriate format for the auction needs to be. The question was to really make sure that we get the ecology of it right. And so it just means having very long meetings. I created a notorious spreadsheet that slowly grew over time that had all the different kind of moving parts of, how the ecology of the turtle dove works. And you just need to kind of really get to know your context. And I think this is kind of the best bit about doing market design, is that you become really embedded in whatever random context you might find yourself in. And you get to know a lot about, what the specifics of it, right? And so inevitably you have to talk to experts who really understand what's going on. And sometimes these experts end up being collaborators, which is wonderful. But in the end, I think the institutional context and understanding it really carefully really matters. So in particular, think about the Faroese auction. It was very important to understand that the bidders in this auction all personally knew each other. Some of them were related through marriage, and it's a small place, Faroe Islands, and so people knew each other, and so that matters for how you design an auction, because you worry more about people talking to each other to the extent where they can perhaps lead to undesirable auction outcomes.
This kind of, there are two questions which I'm kind of going to blend, attempt to blend together here, because they kind of, I think, both relate to what we've just been talking about in terms of kind of like knowing your context. So Brooklyn asks if how you think about political barriers to implementing market design solutions, and they bring up the context of, for example, Brazil, where deforestation's been rife for a number of years. And then, but we also, on the other hand, as well have Andreas, who is really asking about how do we think about market design within a kind of a broader policy context, where we might think about trying to hit kind of bigger like kind of, well, maybe I'm thinking about this, but like kind of tax incentives or other incentives where we think about driving like systematic drivers of say consumption and income. Just wondering if you've got some thoughts on like in kind of the balance of these things within the broader political economy of
these are magnificent questions. So I guess the first one is kind of about the politics of it, and very often, so especially in the fisheries project and the project on turtle doves, it's a very close, kind of collaboration, but you're very close to government policy, and these things are very sensitive. In the context of the Faroese, we're talking about an industry that represents 99% of exports and about half of GDP. So getting this right was very important for the government. And after they ran these auctions, and after we had suggested the redesign, and the redesign had worked well, the new government came in and cancelled all the auctions because the auctions were so unpopular, despite the fact that, as you saw, the auctions seem to be quite favorable to the bidders, right? So everything happens within the political context. There's no way to be able to avoid it. Of course, same with agricultural subsidies, extremely sensitive topics. Of course, the government was very careful about exactly which projects they were picking. So we're very lucky to even get an opportunity to do it. The question about sort of broader market design, right? And so I think it's probably even worth at this point differentiating. Well, how is market design different from tax regulation, right? I mean, that also seems like market design. You're sort of changing the rules of the market, right? And I guess the difference, for me at least, is that market design is often about kind of being able to fix one specific market, and I really kind of trying to get that right. And very often there are countervailing forces in the broader political economy that mean that this is a very small fix, right? This might not be a big deal. A bit like you pointed out, Abby, it's just the turtle dove, right? Or just birds in the east of England, right? And so this might be a quite a small thing in the context of dramatic changes that might be happening elsewhere. And so very often, I think it can be very difficult and slow to change things like, say tax policy, right? Which are, so important and so key, right? That, economists think about all the time, but there are often these pockets of opportunity to at least improve individual markets. And I think this is kind of where market designers often find themselves, is kind of trying to find opportunities for where things can be, at least locally sort of fixed, right? But inevitably they end up interacting with the broader political economy. So even in the case of the turtle dove, we had to really understand what subsidies the farmers were already receiving as we were trying to pay them, and this actually constrained us quite a bit, right? Because we couldn't just say, okay, we're going to take some farmers, stop paying them subsidies, and then see how they react, right? They're already in this system which is not particularly well designed, and we're trying to slightly change their incentives. So it's always a kind of second, third best that you'll find yourself in, right? And very often you take a lot of these bigger structures, unfortunately, as given. And in the case of the mention of the deforestation in Brazil, sometimes very little you can do, right? And so I think you have to be kind of humble. I don't know what I could do as a market designer at the moment in the Brazilian rainforest, because the political economy situation is so atrocious, and there is so little kind of you would be able to do with smart market mechanisms at the moment.
There's a slightly cheeky suggestion from someone or question in terms of, so imagine we're not in the Brazilian context, maybe you are actually back in Costa Rica, and imagine that you did have unlimited amounts of funds and political will by your backing. how exactly would you set up a randomized control trial to figure out how to create additionality in forest preservation? There's actually another question which I'm going to, because we're starting to run short of time, I'm going to roll into that, which is Mackenzie has asked really about dynamic, is there any way of thinking about dynamic incentives as well? So about the fact that there's going to be gaps between maybe announcing policies and measuring baselines, and how do we think about baselines after someone's been cutting down trees potentially for a long time?
Oh, you empiricists, you. These are perfect questions. So on the first one, actually, this has been done. And so we know this works. So Seema Jayachandran, who is at Northwestern, a magnificent environmental economist, has done a randomized control trial of kind of a payment for ecosystem services in, I think it was in Uganda. And what she found is that it worked. And you can look at her wonderful paper in Science, which is only 6 pages long, and it gives you the details of exactly how you do this. So it does require you to have a lot of control over who gets the subsidies, exactly how they happen, and so on. So it's often very difficult to achieve, to really be able to randomize something like a market design intervention. Often you get an opportunity to work with the whole system, but it can be a little bit difficult to evaluate. We have to do it anyway, because the only proof is that things have actually worked. And so we often always thinking about exactly how to evaluate it, and especially for the forestry project. Jonathan in particular is a fantastic empirical economist. He's thinking about exactly how to do evaluation. And the question about dynamic incentives, it's so hard, because once somebody, it's extremely hard. And I think it depends on the context, right? So I think in each one of these contexts, these dynamic issues arise. Once you're in the system, what does this mean for you to lose the subsidy? What does it mean? How aggressive are you going to be in bidding once you've won in the auction once? How do you think about the landscape where some people have already won in the auction and others haven't, right? So let me park the question to say, I have been thinking about it for a long time, but the answer is so big and so context dependent that I encourage you to write many, many, many doctoral theses on it, because there's so much to explore and think about, not just kind of in terms of the empirical side of it, but actually just in terms of theory as well. Because I think that even the economic theory side of it would be new.
Great. Well, unless anyone has any further burning questions, thank you so much, Alex. We are finishing perfectly on time. For those of you who are in the audience, I hope that anyway, you're walking away realizing that markets aren't just about I don't know, for stocks and shares, but turtle doves and trees as well. We will be sharing, there'll be the recording of this talk, and we'll also attempt to put some of the links to the various kind of papers and other works that have been mentioned during the talk on the event website. But yeah, thank you all so much for joining, and especially thank you to Alex for the brilliant talk. And we'll see you hopefully in 2 weeks for the next talk in the series on the future of work. Thanks.